Some laughter isn't harmless. Some laughter is a warning. The laugh echoed louder than the engine. It wasn't nervous. It wasn't accidental. It was confident, practiced, cruel. A young billionaire's son leaned back in his first-class seat, finger raised, mouth wide with amusement. Around him, expensive suits shifted, quiet chuckles followed. Eyes turned away. No one stopped it. No one questioned it. In the aisle stood a poor black girl, barely old enough to understand why grown adults were laughing at her existence. Her clothes were simple. Her voice stayed silent. Her face didn't beg. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just stood there, carrying the weight of a room that had already decided she didn't belong. Phones came out. Smirks spread. The moment stretched, feeding on itself. But what none of them noticed was the man watching from behind. The pilot hadn't spoken yet, but his eyes had already changed. And when power finally speaks, it doesn't raise its voice. It changes the room. Ethan Caldwell leaned back as if the seat had been molded around his sense of entitlement. At 2004, he wore privilege the way others wore cologne, subtle to him, overwhelming to everyone else. The son of real estate titan Richard Caldwell, Ethan had grown up believing doors opened because they recognized him, not because anyone chose to be kind. His watch alone cost more than most people's rent. Yet he checked it impatiently, annoyed that the flight attendants hadn't refilled his glass fast enough. Around him sat friends who mirrored his ease, polished smiles, casual arrogance, laughter sharpened by the confidence that nothing here could touch them. For Ethan, flying first class wasn't a luxury, it was a confirmation of who he was. The cabin reinforced a truth he'd never questioned, that some people belonged closer to the sky than others. A few. Rows back, Naomi Brooks stepped carefully into that same space, her presence like a quiet ripple across still water. She was 19, slim, dressed in simple jeans and a faded hoodie, her backpack hugged tightly against her chest. A booking glitch had reassigned her seat, pulling her unexpectedly from economy into first class. The upgrade felt unreal, almost like a mistake she might be punished for acknowledging. Naomi had earned her place in the world through effort rather than inheritance. A scholarship student headed to Los Angeles for a national science competition. She carried notebooks filled with equations and ideas that kept her awake at night. Her future depended on precision, discipline, and hope. Yet as she reached her seat, she became suddenly aware that none of that was visible. All the cabin could see was what she wasn't wearing. Eyes lifted. Conversations paused. The contrast was immediate and uncomfortable. Ethan noticed her instantly. His gaze lingered just long enough to register surprise, then curved into a smile that wasn't kind. He leaned toward his friends, lowering his voice, but not his amusement. They followed his eyes, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shared mockery. Well, one of them murmured, loud enough to be heard, "Looks like Charity is flying first class today." Soft laughter followed, carefully measured to avoid outright accusation but sharp enough to land. Naomi heard it. She felt it settle in her chest like unexpected turbulence. She kept her eyes down, pretending to adjust her seatbelt, reminding herself that she hadn't done anything wrong. The flight attendants moved past her with professional smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. No one asked if she was comfortable. No one welcomed her the way they had welcomed Ethan. Their silence was efficient, practiced, and heavy with implication. In a cabin designed for service, some guests were still expected to shrink. Naomi opened her notebook, her fingers steady despite the tension pressing against her ribs. She focused on the familiar comfort of formulas and diagrams, on the future she was flying toward rather than the present she was enduring. Her mind traced patterns of logic, clinging to a world where results depended on truth rather than perception. Ethan watched her for a moment longer, intrigued by her refusal to react. He whispered another comment, this one about lottery winners and system errors, and his friends chuckled again. Their laughter grew bolder, fed by the absence of consequences around them. Other passengers listened without intervening, choosing comfort over conscience. The narration of the moment unfolded quietly, observing the unseen turbulence rattling the cabin. This wasn't about a seat or a ticket. It was about who was assumed to belong. The sky above them was shared, but the space within the aircraft had been divided long before takeoff. Bias didn't announce itself loudly here, hidden glances, pauses, and the way. No one spoke up. Naomi turned a page, her jaw tightening just slightly. She had learned long ago that dignity sometimes meant endurance. Still, the weight of being judged without being known pressed heavily on her. She wondered how many times brilliance had been dismissed because it didn't arrive wrapped in wealth. Ethan stretched, satisfied, unaware that his casual cruelty revealed more about him than her silence ever could. To him, this was entertainment, a way to affirm his place without ever earning it. He didn't see the irony soaring above him, that true elevation came from character, not camouflage. As the plane leveled out, the laughter finally faded, replaced by the low hum of engines and the illusion of calm. Naomi kept reading, steadying herself, unaware that the flight was about to shift in a way none of them expected. As the laughter grows louder, the pilot's calm voice breaks over the intercom. But there's something unusual in his tone. Wealth can buy comfort, but it can't purchase decency. Ethan Caldwell had learned the language of power before he learned restraint. His childhood unfolded in penthouses and private schools where rules bent softly around him, where mistakes were absorbed by money and apologies were outsourced to assistants. In that world, excess wasn't indulgence, it was expectation. Cars arrived when summoned. Problems disappeared when inconvenient, and people who disagreed were quietly removed from the frame. Ethan didn't grow arrogant overnight. He was raised on a steady diet of affirmation that told him he was exceptional simply for existing. His father, Richard Caldwell, had built his empire the same way he taught his son to move through life decisively, unapologetically, and without looking back. To Richard, progress meant climbing higher no matter who remained below. Deals were closed with smiles that never reached the eyes, and success was measured in square footage and silence. Employees were replaceable, communities negotiable, and consequences optional. Ethan absorbed these lessons not through lectures, but through observation. He watched how waiters were ignored, how assistants were interrupted, how apologies were framed as favors rather than necessities. That upbringing shaped a particular kind of blindness. When Ethan looked at Naomi, he didn't see a person traveling toward a dream. He saw an interruption to an image he believed he owned. His remarks weren't fueled by hatred alone, but by a learned disregard that treated dignity as a luxury item. To him, decency was performative, something you displayed when it benefited you, not a principle that guided behavior when no one was watching. Naomi's story ran on a different currency entirely. She had been raised by a single mother who measured success in perseverance rather than profit. Their apartment was small, their schedules crowded, but their values were expansive. Naomi learned early that effort mattered, that preparation was a form of respect, and that silence could sometimes be a shield. She worked part-time jobs, tutoring, shelving books, cleaning labs to support her education. Each paycheck a brick, laid carefully toward a future she refused to abandon. Her dream carried more than personal ambition. Representing her community at the International Science Expo in Los Angeles meant proving that brilliance didn't require inheritance. It meant showing younger students that opportunity could be built with patience and courage. As she sat in that first-class seat, notes open on her lap, she was carrying more than equations. She was carrying expectation, hope, and the quiet weight of everyone who had been told to wait their turn indefinitely. The cabin attendants noticed the tension long before it reached a breaking point. They heard the comments, saw the glances, and felt the imbalance settle like pressure in their ears. Yet they hesitated. Ethan's last name wasn't just a name. It was a reputation, one tied to frequent luxury bookings, corporate partnerships, and complaints that could cost jobs. In an industry built on service, fear often traveled faster than fairness. Their smiles stayed neutral, their steps measured, their intervention postponed. Naomi felt that hesitation as clearly as she felt the mockery. She had been taught, like generations before H.R., to stay composed, to avoid being labeled difficult, to endure without complaint. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was survival shaped by history. Still, endurance came at a cost. Each unchallenged laugh carved a small ache, a reminder that equality was often theoretical, rarely practiced. The narration lingered on the contrast between their worlds. Above them, the sky stretched open and impartial, indifferent to wealth or color. Below, inside the cabin, invisible lines dictated comfort and credibility. Ethan's world assumed the right to judge. Naomi's world required a discipline to persist. One had been trained to take space, the other to minimize herself within it. Ethan sensed the attention he commanded and mistook it for respect. He leaned back, satisfied, unaware that his confidence rested on borrowed ground. He had never been asked to justify his place, never questioned whether he belonged. That certainty insulated him from self-reflection, allowing arrogance to masquerade as ease. Naomi closed her notebook gently, her focus wavering as a new awareness passed through the can. The engines hummed steadily, but something had shifted. A quiet expectation replaced the earlier laughter. as if the air itself were holding a breath. She glanced up just as the intercom clicked on. The pilot's voice emerged, calm but deliberate, carrying an authority that cut through the cabin's assumption. He addressed the passengers briefly, then paused, as if choosing his next words with care. The attendants straightened. Ethan frowned, irritated by the interruption. Naomi listened, heart steady but alert, as the pilot made an unexpected request, one that redirected every gaze in the cabin and challenged every unspoken hierarchy in that space. The pilot requests Naomi to come forward to the cockpit, stunning everyone, especially Ethan. Sometimes the seat of power shifts midair. A hush swept through the first-class cabin as Naomi rose from her seat. Chairs creaked softly, eyes followed her, and the earlier laughter thinned into uncertain murmurs. She adjusted the strap of her backpack and moved down the aisle with measured steps, each one steady despite the heat climbing her neck. Confusion lingered in the air like static, charged and restless. No one quite understood why she had been called forward, but everyone sensed that something had slipped beyond the usual script. Ethan's reaction came quickly, sharp and careless. He laughed louder than before, a sound meant to reclaim control. He leaned toward his friends, voice dripping with assumption, suggesting she was finally being corrected for causing a scene. The words drew a few uneasy chuckles, but they didn't land the way they had earlier. The cabin felt different now, less cooperative with his confidence, as if it were waiting to see who would be proven right. Naomi didn't look back. She reached the cockpit door as a flight attendant opened it with a nod that carried unexpected respect. Inside, the sea was quieter, brighter with instruments and steady hands. The pilot turned in his seat, calm and composed, his presence grounded in decades of responsibility rather than entitlement. Captain James Rourke introduced himself simply, his voice even, authoritative, and kind in a way that didn't seek approval. He explained there was a minor technical delay being reviewed, nothing alarming, and invited Naomi to sit for a moment. The invitation wasn't framed as an order or a test, it was offered as courtesy. Naomi took the jump seat, her heart steadying as curiosity replaced apprehension. She answered his questions with clarity, explaining her destination, her competition, and the work she hoped to present. As she spoke, recognition flickered across the captain's face. He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing not with suspicion, but with focus. He asked about her research, about a safety model she had developed during a national youth program sponsored by NASA. Naomi hesitated, surprised, then nodded. She explained the model's purpose, how it identified micro-failure patterns in flight systems before they escalated. Her words flowed with practiced precision, shaped by years of study and quiet confidence. Captain Rourke listened, then smiled, a slow expression of respect that shifted the room's gravity. He told her he had seen her work before. Before retiring from the Air Force, he had been an engineer, involved in training manuals that emphasized predictive safety. Her model, refined by a team of young finalists, had been integrated as a case study. He remembered her name because the solution had been elegant, practical, and ahead of its time. Outside the cockpit, the crew sensed the change before they understood it. Glances were exchanged, whispers restrained. The idea that the quiet young woman from first class wasn't an inconvenience, but a contributor to aviation safety sent a ripple through their assumptions. Titles and appearances began to lose their weight, replaced by a different measure of worth. Inside, Naomi felt something unfamiliar unfold, not triumph, but validation. Not because she sought recognition, but because truth had surfaced on its own terms. Captain Rourke thanked her for her work, acknowledging the impact it had beyond any single competition. His words carried accountability, a reminder that progress often came from power overlooked. Back in the cabin, Ethan's laughter faded into irritation. He noticed the delay stretching, the attention drifting away from him. Conversations stalled as curiosity replaced judgment. The hierarchy he relied on began to invert, piece by piece, without confrontation or spectacle. No one announced the shift. It simply happened, undeniable and quiet. The flight attendants stood straighter now, their earlier hesitation replaced by alert respect. They watched the cockpit door, aware that something meaningful was unfolding beyond their routines. The cabin no longer felt like a stage for performance, but a shared space awaiting truth. When the cockpit door opened, Naomi stepped out with the captain beside her. She returned toward her seat, posture unchanged, but the air around her felt altered. Eyes followed her again, this time with questions rather than ridicule. Ethan looked away first, unsettled by the realization that his certainty had been built on ignorance. Captain Rourke paused near the intercom, his hand resting lightly on it. The cabin fell silent, anticipation threading through every row. His demeanor shifted, professional calm sharpening into deliberate clarity. This wasn't an announcement about weather or altitude. It carried intention. Passengers leaned forward, sensing that what came next would redefine the journey they thought they were on. Captain Rourke picks up the intercom. His tone changes completely as he addresses the passengers by name. Respect can't be demanded by status, it must be earned by character. The intercom crackled softly before settling into a clear, steady hum, and every conversation dissolved at once. Captain Rourke's voice carried through the cabin with a calm authority that no amount of wealth could imitate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, pausing just long enough for anticipation to gather. "Today we have the honor of flying with a national NASA finalist, Miss Naomi Brooks." The words landed not as spectacle, but as truth, measured and deliberate, cutting cleanly through every assumption that had filled the cabin minutes before. Silence followed, deep and absolute. Faces that had once curved with amusement now stiffened with disbelief. Passengers turned fully in their seats, some leaning forward as if proximity might help them understand what they had misjudged. The laughter that had earlier floated so freely was gone, replaced by the uncomfortable sound of people re-examining their certainty. Naomi felt the shift before she fully understood it, the air around her tightening with attention she had never asked for. Ethan's reaction was immediate and unguarded. His body went still, shoulders rigid as if the announcement had stripped gravity from him. The smile he had worn like armor vanished, leaving confusion and something dangerously close to shame. He stared ahead, replaying his own words in his mind, now sharp and exposed. For the first time, he felt the weight of being seen without control over the narrative. The narration lingered on that moment, examining how swiftly perception could turn when society reassigned value. Minutes ago, Naomi's presence had been questioned. Now it was being validated by an institution powerful enough to command respect. The irony was unmistakable. Her worth had not changed, only the lens through which others chose to view her. It was a quiet indictment of a system that waited for credentials before granting dignity. "Thank you." The flight attendants moved with new urgency, their earlier hesitation replaced by careful attentiveness. One approached Naomi discreetly, offering water, another asking if she needed anything at all. Their apologies were soft, almost whispered, carried more by gesture than words. They were not cruel people, but they were participants in a hierarchy that rewarded silence over courage. Now, faced with accountability, they chose compassion. Captain Rourke's announcement was more than acknowledgement. It was symbolic. By naming Naomi publicly, he reclaimed the dignity that had been quietly denied to her moments earlier. He didn't embellish her achievements or dramatize her story. He simply stated the truth, trusting that it was enough. In doing so, he reminded the cabin that respect rooted in character required no decoration. From Naomi's perspective, the attention felt surreal. She sat upright, hands folded, resisting the urge to shrink or apologize for the space she occupied. Humility guided her response, not because she doubted herself, but because she understood the difference between recognition and superiority. When the captain's words ended, she met his eyes briefly and nodded, gratitude expressed without spectacle. She thanked him softly when he passed her seat, her voice steady, her expression calm. There was no gloating, no desire to reverse the humiliation she had endured. She knew that power reversal didn't require cruelty to be effective. Grace, she understood, old be its own form of justice. Around her, passengers watched closely, some relieved, others unsettled by the mirror her composure held up to them. Ethan avoided looking in her direction, his earlier confidence eroded by the realization that his assumptions had been hollow. For the first time, he felt what it was like to be judged by a moment rather than a surname. The discomfort pressed against him, unfamiliar and unwelcome, yet impossible to ignore. It was a lesson he had never been forced to learn, delivered without confrontation, without valence, therefore impossible to dismiss. The cabin gradually resumed its low murmur, but the tone had changed. Conversations were quieter, more restrained, as if everyone understood they were now sharing a space shaped by accountability. Naomi returned to her notes, not because she needed distraction, but because her purpose remained unchanged. Recognition had not altered her destination, it had simply clarified the path. As the plane continued westward, another layer of truth hovered just beyond the visible rose. In the very important person cabin, separated by a thin wall and a lifetime of influence, Richard Caldwell sat listening. He had heard every word of the announcement, felt the subtle shift in tone, recognized the name that now commanded the cabin's respect. His jaw tightened slightly, not with anger, but with calculation. He understood symbolism when he saw it. The legacy he had built on dominance and control suddenly felt fragile, yet not by protest, but by integrity. The realization unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. Somewhere behind him, his son sat silent, grappling with a version of the world that no longer bent automatically in his favor. The aircraft moved steadily through open sky, unchanged in altitude but transformed in meaning. What had begun as a flight divided by class was becoming something else. Entirely a shared journey marked by truth, empathy, and the first stirrings of reform. Unbeknownst to the cabin, Ethan's father, Richard Caldwell, is seated just beyond the curtain, having overheard every word of the announcement. Every empire is tested when its air is humbled. The curtain separating the very important section shifted softly, and Richard Caldwell stepped into view with the restrained confidence of a man accustomed to command. Yet something about his posture was different now, his shoulders slightly tense, his expression pulled tight, between confusion and embarrassment. He had heard the announcement clearly, every syllable echoing in his mind, and it had unsettled him in a way few things ever had. This was not a boardroom where influence could redirect outcomes. This was a public space where truth had arrived uninvited. He scanned the cabin until his eyes found Ethan. His son sat rigidly, staring ahead, the earlier swagger nowhere to be found. Richard moved toward him without drawing attention, lowering himself into the adjacent seat. Their conversation remained quiet, contained within a narrow pocket of space, but the weight of it pressed heavily against the silence between them. Richard asked what had happened, not with anger, but with a controlled urgency that demanded honesty. Ethan's response came in fragments, defensive at first, then faltering. The confidence he had relied on fractured under the scrutiny of a father whose approval had always been assumed, never questioned. He minimized, justified, then finally fell silent. In that pause, the truth settled. Richard didn't need every detail. He recognized the pattern too well. He had seen it before, nurtured it even, mistaking dominance for leadership and entitlement for success. The narration lingered on the space between them, where generations collided. This was not merely a father correcting a son. It was a legacy confronting its own decay. Richard realized, with an ache he hadn't anticipated, that the values he had modeled, efficiency without empathy, ambition without accountability, had shaped Ethan more deeply than any lecture ever could. Moral rot, he understood now, did not announce itself loudly. It passed quietly, inherited like property. A few rows ahead, Naomi remained seated, unaware of the reckoning unfolding behind her. She focused on her notes again, grounded in the familiar structure of logic and preparation. The storm she had endured felt distant now, not because it hadn't mattered, but because she refused to let it define her. She did not know that her presence had become a mirror, forcing others to see what they had avoided for years. Richard's gaze drifted briefly toward her, recognition dawning not of her achievements, but of her restraint. Something about that steadiness stirred an old memory. He recalled a younger version of himself, sharp-tongued and ambitious, mocking those he deemed obstacles rather than people. He remembered how easily laughter had come then, how unquestioned his assumptions had been. Back then, no one had interrupted him with truth at 30,000 feet from the cockpit. Captain Rourke observed the cabin through the lens of long experience. He recognized Richard Caldwell immediately. Some names never faded. Years earlier, Rourke had worked on a public safety project designed to modernize training systems across commercial aviation. The proposal had been sound, the benefits clear, but it had been quietly dismantled after aggressive corporate lobbying traced back to Caldwell's company, which had deemed the reforms too costly. Careers had shifted, progress delayed, all in service of profit margin. The connection lingered unspoken, but it shaped Rourke's resolve. Today's announcement had not been revenge, it had been alignment. He believed institutions only regained credibility when they honored truth, regardless of who it unsettled. Seeing Naomi recognized for work that directly contradicted the shortcuts of power felt like a small correction. In a long, crooked line, back in the cabin, the atmosphere had transformed into a theater of truth. No one spoke openly about it, yet every passenger felt implicated. Some reconsidered their silence, others their laughter, still others the comfort they took in neutrality. At this altitude, stripped of routine distractions, values felt exposed. The plane became a moving cross-section of society, suspended between where it had been and where it might choose to go. Richard returned his attention to Ethan, his voice low but firm. There was no shouting, no spectacle, only disappointment, sharpened by clarity. He spoke of consequences not as punishment, but as responsibility. For the first time, Ethan listened without interruption. The moment demanded more than defense. It demanded reckoning. Whether he would change remained uncertain, but the illusion of invincibility had been pierced. Naomi shifted slightly in her seat, sensing movement behind her but not turning around. She remained focused forward, her dignity intact, unaware that her quiet endurance had catalyzed conversations far beyond her awareness. That, perhaps, was the most powerful reversal of all, not domination, but influence. Without force, the engines hummed steadily as the captain adjusted his course. A message fro. Air control appeared on his screen, alerting him to a pocket of turbulence ahead. He acknowledged it calmly, fingers steady, eyes clear. Turbulence was expected. What mattered was preparation and response. He glanced once more at the cabin, at the subtle transformations underway, and allowed himself a measured breath. The aircraft pressed onward, carrying not just passengers, but the weight of introspection, the possibility of reform, and the fragile hope that accountability could still alter a legacy long overdue. For change, a calm chime sounds from the cockpit. Air control warns of turbulence. Ahead, Captain Rourke's voice remains steady, but his tone carries deliberate resolve. Sometimes turbulence outside mirrors the one within. The first shudder passed through the aircraft like a held breath finally released. Overhead bins rattled softly, cups trembled against tray tables, and conversations dissolved into instinctive silence. The cabin lights flickered once, not enough to alarm, but enough to remind everyone that control was always conditional. At 35,000 feet, wealth, status, and influence lost their sharp edges. Gravity didn't discriminate, and fear leveled the hierarchy with quiet efficiency. A child, a few rows ahead, began to cry, the sound thin and frightened, cutting through the hum of the engine. His small hands gripped the armrests as his mother tried to soothe him, her own voice betraying tension. Naomi noticed immediately. Without hesitation, he leaned forward, unbuckled briefly when the shaking eased, and spoke to him gently. She explained what turbulence was in simple terms, comparing it to bumps on a road, her tone calm and reassuring. She showed him how to breathe slowly, counting softly, turning fear into something manageable. The child watched her closely, his crying subsiding as her steadiness anchored him. Naomi didn't perform the gesture for attention. It came naturally, compassion practiced through years of looking beyond herself. When the seatbelt sign chimed again, she settled back into her seat, offering the boy a small smile that carried more comfort than any announcement could. Ethan saw all of it. He sat frozen, hands clasped tightly, his earlier bravado stripped away by the movement of the plane and the clarity of the moment. Shame settled heavy in his chest, not loud or dramatic, but persistent. He realized, with uncomfortable precision, that Naomi's dignity had never wavered, not when she was mocked, not when she was judged, and not now, when fear pressed equally on them all. The contrast was unavoidable. While he had relied on arrogance to feel secure, she relied on empathy. The narration widened its lens, drawing meaning from the motion of the aircraft. Turbulence became more than a physical event. It was a moral symbol, a cleansing disruption that stripped away illusion. Arrogance, like smooth air, thrived unchallenged. It was only under pressure that its fragility became visible. In the aching cabin, people confronted the truth that comfort had made easy to ignore. Control was shared, vulnerability universal. Captain Rourke's voice cut through the tension, firm and steady, carrying assurance rather than authority. He explained the situation clearly, outlining what the crew was doing and what passengers could expect. His calm didn't dismiss fear, it contained it. Then, almost casually, he mentioned that updated turbulence response protocols, informed by recent research, had significantly improved flight stability and safety. He didn't name Naomi directly, but the implication resonated with those who knew. For Richard Caldwell, the words landed with unexpected force. He watched Naomi from his seat, observing the way she had comforted the child without expectation or acknowledgement. This was humility in action, not the rehearsed kind displayed at God, but the quiet kind that surfaced when no reward was guaranteed. For the first time in a long while, Richard questioned the framework through which he had measured success. Wealth had taught him dominance. Humility was teaching him relevance. The turbulence intensified briefly, then began to ease, the plane adjusting smoothly as designed. Passengers exhaled collectively, the tension giving way to reflection. No one spoke immediately. The silence that followed was different from before, not awkward or complicit, but thoughtful. It carried respect, earned not through titles or announcements, but through conduct. Ethan's gaze lingered on Naomi, his expression stripped of defense. He replayed his earlier words, now hollow and indefensible. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that power without empathy was empty, and privilege without accountability was a liability. The realization didn't redeem him instantly, but it cracked something open, creating space where growth might eventually take root. Around them, other passengers processed their own reckonings. Some thought about moments they had stayed silent. Others reconsidered judgments they made too easily. The cabin had become an unwitting classroom, suspended between cities, teaching lessons no institution could mandate. Justice here wasn't punitive. It was revelatory. It showed people who they had been and invited them to choose differently. As the shaking subsided, the engines returned to their steady rhythm, and the seatbelt sign remained lit a moment longer, as if to ensure the lesson had time to settle. Naomi sat quietly, hands folded, her breathing even. She didn't look around to gauge reactions. Her sense of worth didn't depend on the cabin's approval. She had done what felt right, nothing more. Captain Rourke monitored the instruments, satisfied with the aircraft's response. He believed moments like this defined leadership, not the absence of disruption, but the ability to guide others through it with clarity and care. He glanced once at the passenger manifest, then at the cabin camera, his expression thoughtful. Accountability, he knew, was most effective when paired with opportunity. The chime sounded softly, signaling a shift not just in conditions but in intention. The captain leaned toward the intercom, his voice measured, respectful, and purposeful. He addressed the cabin briefly, confirming that the turbulence was behind them, and thanking everyone for their cooperation. Then he paused, choosing his next words carefully. In the can, heads lifted. Ethan straightened instinctively, a flicker of apprehension crossing his face. Naomi remained still, unaware that the next moment would test not the strength of the plane, but the courage of a man being asked to confront himself. As the skies smooth out, Captain Rourke calmly invites Ethan Caldwell to come forward to the cockpit. True education begins where ego ends. Ethan entered the cockpit with reluctant steps, his confidence drained of its usual polish. The narrow space felt smaller than he expected, not because of its size, but because of what it demanded from him. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and for the first time that day, he looked unsure of who he was supposed to be. The door closed softly behind him, sealing him inside a moment he could no longer avoid. Captain Rourke didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He turned in his seat just enough to meet Ethan's eyes, his expression steady, composed, and unyielding in its calm. He spoke not as a man asserting authority, but as one offering perspective. He explained that leadership was not about elevation above others, but responsibility toward them. Intelligence, he said, only mattered when paired with humility, because knowledge without empathy had a habit of becoming destructive. He spoke of Naomi's work, not in technical detail, but in principle. He described how her contribution had improved safety for people she would never meet, how she had offered solutions without demanding recognition. Then he contrasted that with inherited privilege, explaining that access without effort could dull awareness, and comfort without accountability could rot character. Respect, he reminded Ethan, was never transferred through bloodlines. It was earned through conduct. Ethan listened in silence, the words landing heavier than any reprimand. Shame crept in, sharp and undeniable, but beneath it stirred something else, an awakening that unsettled him more than guilt ever could. He realized that the power he had relied on was fragile, dependent on silence and compliance. Naomi had needed none of that. Her dignity had stood on its own, unaffected by mockery or validation. The narration lingered on that internal shift, quiet but profound. Empathy, it suggested, was not an instinct reserved for the kind-hearted. It was a skill that could be learned, even late, even painfully. Change rarely announced itself with certainty. It began as discomfort, as the uneasy recognition that the world was larger than one's own reflection. Throughout this exchange, Naomi remained unaware. She sat in her seat, reading again, grounded in purpose, untouched by the lesson unfolding nearby. Her absence from the moment gave it meaning. She did not need to witness accountability to be worthy of it. Her value was not contingent on apology or transformation. It existed independently, complete. When Ethan finally left the cockpit, his steps were slower, more deliberate. He returned to his seat without speaking, eyes fixed ahead. As he passed Naomi's row, he felt the urge to look at her, to say something, anything, but he couldn't. Not yet. The weight of understanding pressed too firmly against his chest. Silence, for once, was not avoidance, but acknowledgement. The cabin felt different now, reordered without instruction. The old hierarchy had dissolved, laced by something quieter and more honest. Passengers sensed it in the way conversations resumed, more thoughtful, less performative. Equality had not been declared, it had been restored, piece by piece, through recognition rather than force. Naomi closed her notebook and rested her hands, unaware that she had become the axis around which the cabin had turned. She had not argued, demanded, or defended. She had simply remained herself. That, the narration reflected, was the most radical act of all as the plane began its gradual descent. The city lights ahead faint, but promising. Captain Rourke adjusted the controls with practiced ease. He glanced once more toward the cabin, his expression thoughtful. Lessons, he knew, mattered most when they extended beyond the moment. The intercom chimed softly, drawing everyone's attention. One final time, as the plane starts its descent, Captain Rourke makes a final announcement, one that leaves the entire cabin quietly emotional. The softest landings come from the hardest lessons. The intercom chimed once more as the aircraft began its final descent. The city of Los Angeles stretching beneath the windows like a constellation brought down to earth. Captain Rourke's voice carried through the cabin, warm now, reflective, stripped of formality but not of purpose. He thanked the passengers for their patience, then paused, allowing the silence to gather meaning. When he spoke again, his words were deliberate. He expressed gratitude to Miss Naomi Brooks for reminding everyone on board what real brilliance and grace looked like, not just in achievement, but in conduct. For a brief moment, the cabin held its breath. Then applause rose, hesitant at first, then swelling into something genuine. Hands came together across aisles and classes, some clapping out of admiration, others out of relief, many out of recognition that they had witnessed something rare. Naomi felt the sound wash over her like unexpected warmth. Her cheeks flushed, her shoulders stiffened slightly, but she did not stand or wave. She simply nodded, eyes lowered, absorbing the moment without claiming ownership of it. Ethan watched from his seat, the applause cutting deeper than any criticism could have. It wasn't resentment he felt, but clarity. The attention she received did not diminish him. It illuminated what he had lacked. Beside him, Richard Caldwell sat quietly, his gaze fixed forward, the weight of the flight settling into resolve rather than defensiveness. The descent continued smoothly, the wheels preparing to meet the ground, the lesson preparing to fall. Them beyond the cabin, when the plane touched down, the landing was gentle, almost symbolic. There was no jolt, no drama, just a seamless return to Earth. As passengers unbuckled and stood, the atmosphere felt altered, lighter yet more serious. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, measured, thoughtful, as if everyone carried a private reflection they weren't ready to release. Ethan and his father waited until the aisle cleared before moving. Their approach toward Naomi was unhurried, stripped of entitlement. Richard spoke first, his voice low, controlled, and sincere. He acknowledged the disrespect that had unfolded, not excusing it, not deflecting responsibility. Ethan followed, his apology quieter, less polished, but honest in its discomfort. There were no explanations offered, only accountability. Naomi listened without interruption. She studied their faces briefly, then nodded. Her response was simple, unadorned, and final. She said that they were all still learning. There was no forgiveness theatrically granted, no moral superiority claimed. Her professionalism in that moment carried more power than anger ever could. It allowed the apology to stand without turning it into a transaction as passengers filed past them toward the exit. Some glanced at Naomi with respect, others with introspection. The narration widened its lens, pulling back from the individuals to the pattern they represented. One flight, one incident, yet it mirrored a society divided by class and race, by who was presumed capable and who was required to prove themselves. The cabin had been a microcosm, and what unfolded there was not extraordinary, because it was rare, but because it was honest. Days later, away from the noise of the airport and the immediacy of the moment, Richard Caldwell followed through on a decision that surprised even those closest to him. He funded a SC Holership for underprivileged science students, placing it in Naomi's name without seeking public praise. The gesture did not erase his past, nor did it absolve systemic harm, but it marked a beginning. Reform, the story reminded, often started imperfectly, with acknowledgement rather than absolution. Naomi returned to her life, to her studies, to the competition that awaited her. The flight became a memory, a chapter rather than a definition. She carried forward the same quiet resolve, aware now that her presence alone could challenge assumptions without ever raising her voice. Her dignity had traveled farther than the plane itself. The final image lingered as passengers disembarked, each stepping into their own futures, altered in ways they might not fully articulate. The camera of the narration lifted upward, Past the terminal, past the runway, to the open sky above, clear, level, endless. The sky that had never judged them, only reflected them. Sometimes, altitude reveals attitude, and that's where humanity finds its course correction. If a single flight can change attitudes, imagine what stories can change lives. If this journey moved you, chances are someone else needs to feel it too. Sharing it isn't just support, it's responsibility. Stay connected for more stories that challenge perspectives and awaken conscience. And now, a question for you: if you were on that flight, which seat would you choose? The one watching in silence, the one laughing comfortably, or the one saying, ending with truth? Tell us in the comments.